Pearson Ravitz' story begins with Dr. Stephanie Pearson, a passionate OB-GYN at the height of her career. But when a shoulder injury struck during a precipitous delivery, her dreams were shattered, leaving her unable to practice medicine. Determined to make a difference, Stephanie became an advocate for her peers, guiding them through the complex disability process. Alongside insurance expert Scott Ravitz, Stephanie founded Pearson Ravitz, a company determined to approach insurance differently. Together, they set their mission to educate and empower physicians to protect their most valuable asset, their income, and the most important people in their life, their family. Today, Pearson Ravitz serves the medical community in all 50 states. At Pearson Ravitz, they understand the unique concerns of physicians. Physician-founded and physician-focused, Pearson Ravitz builds human connections before they create quotes. Life can change in an instant. It's hard to imagine that a sudden illness or injury could leave you and your family in a devastating financial situation. But with a little planning and guidance, you can prepare for every possibility. Visit PearsonRavitz.com today to schedule your consultation with the Pearson Ravitz advisor.
Finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Welcome back, everybody, to BS Free MD podcast with your co-hosts, Tim and May Hindmarsh. And I'm just going to give a quick shout out. Happy Thanksgiving. I hope you're not in too much of a turkey coma to listen to this amazing podcast with our guest, Dr. Mark McDonald, the dissident MD. And so chew on some dessert, some apple pie, and keep awake for this. So today, we are super excited to have Dr. McDonald with us. He's a distinguished psychiatrist with an amazing, rich background in both adult and child and adolescent psychiatry. And he was born and raised in Los Angeles and graduated from UC Berkeley and the Medical College of Wisconsin. So with extensive training at UCLA, he now works primarily with children in private practice in West Los Angeles. Notably, Dr. McDonald diagnosed the phenomenon of mass delusional psychosis and has been a vocal advocate for the reopening of America's schools. His insights have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, The Federalist, radio shows like Dennis Prager's Ultimate Issues Hour, and TV outlets like Tucker Carlson Tonight. He's also the host and co-host, I should say, of the podcast Informed Dissent and the author of United States of Fear and Freedom from Fear. You can follow his work on his website, www.dissidentmd.com, and on social media platforms. And finally, we were honored to hear him speak at the Freedom Conference in Ocala 2 weeks ago. And without further ado, welcome,
Hello, so
Dr.
glad to
Mark
be
McDonald.
here and to see you both again face to face, up close and personal, unlike at a 900-person conference where everybody looks like a little pinhead in the background and I have no time to talk to anybody. So it's great that you reached out and said, come on our show. We share your passion and interest in the issues you discussed at the conference, and that's what we're here to talk about.
Absolutely. How on earth did you go to Berkeley, Wisconsin, and UCLA and not turn
I actually
into a
showed
woke
up as a woke
monster?
monster. Well, I wouldn't say monster, but it's certainly wokier person than I am now, and was turned completely against all forms of communalism and socialism by my experience in my second year at Berkeley, living in a co-op house called Casa Zimbabwe. Yes, this is a serious actual event that occurred in my life. I lived in a co-op house where you pay a subsidized rent in order to avoid being, ripped off basically by those expensive dormitories. And the exchange is essentially labor for discount. So everybody contributes to the cleaning, the cooking, the management. It's cooperative living. It's kind of like a kibbutz light. And it was started in the 60s at Berkeley by the hippie generation as a way to communalize one's life and it degenerated, as all communal experiments do, into a complete hellscape of depravity. And the place that I lived in was so filthy that the public health department actually came in and did a vermin inspection in the kitchen and shut it down twice in the first 4 months, the first semester that I was there, during a party, because they don't want to exclude anybody, obviously, from the house, because it's open to everybody, right? They let in homeless people who set fire to a couch, and then the communal hot tub developed a mold infestation because it had not been cleaned for God knows how many years, and some people actually developed ringworm. So these were just 3 examples of the reasons why I personally experienced and discovered the necessarily unavoidable logical progression and outcome of communism, which is filth, which is crime, which is theft and violence. And after that 1 year in Casa Zimbabwe, I ran as far as I could, got my own apartment, paid full fee rent, and never looked back.
Perfect. So what you were actually describing,
you see, I was
Portland.
prescient. What I lived through at Casa Zimbabwe was a microcosm of today's downtown Portland. Filth, depravity, crime, violence, hellscape.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking 100% what it is.
A casa, a true casa in Zimbabwe would be cleaner and taken care of much more.
Taxi driver I had in Oregon at the CHD event took me from the airport to Children's Health Defense, to the Children's Health Defense talk that I gave. And I asked him where he was from, and he said it was a city in India, probably Delhi. Really nice guy. He was a Sikh. He had a turban on his head. And I said, what do you think about this area? And he said, I was just giving him a vague question. I didn't want to push him in either direction. What do you think? He immediately said, absolutely filthy, dangerous, violent, dirty. Every possible decision politically that's been made is the wrong one. And then he said, my own city in India is cleaner than this piece of crap.
Yeah, and the population density of his city in India is probably 10x what Portland is. I mean, Portland's only, the greater Portland area is what, like 1 million, 1.2 million? I mean, it's not that big. And so oh boy, yes.
Well,
yes.
We could go on that.
We could go on and
forever.
on.
So
if we keep talking about it, I will continue to smell it in my olfactory memory, which I don't want to do anymore.
So any particular thing that got you interested in psychiatry?
I decided to do psychiatry
child
because
psychiatry.
I hated exam rooms with fluorescent lights and those tables with the paper rolls that crinkle, go up and down, with horrible air conditioning that makes everybody completely frigid and gets goosebumps and makes your patients fear seeing the doctor. I didn't want to be part of that industry. And in my first year of medical school, I took, as all people did, a required psychiatric 4-week lecture course with a man who was working down the road from the school as a child psychiatrist. And this guy was amazing. There were no PowerPoints. There was no data. He actually walked up to the front of the hall. He sat down on a desk, sat on the desk and faced us and looked back and forth in the audience, which was all students. And he started pointing to students. And he would point to them and say, you in the yellow shirt, what's your name? Oh, my name's Miriam. How are you doing, Miriam? How you been sleeping recently? You feeling okay? What's your stress level like? And he did this for the whole lecture. And people started to get more relaxed and calm. And they started to discuss things like, well, I haven't slept for weeks. It's horrible. Why? Nobody cares about us. He's like, I totally get that. This is a really mentally unwell period for all of you in your life. What are you going to do about it? And everybody just stared at him. Oh, I don't know. I guess just drink more coffee. He's like, no, you've got to take care of yourself. He was really sincerely caring. He was actually an interesting guy. He was a volunteer reservist and had just come back from Afghanistan. And he had been at the hospital in Germany where all of the soldiers get sent back to for depressurization mentally after all the trauma. And he had seen hundreds of these soldiers with PTSD from Afghanistan. This was back in 2003. And was just filled with really interesting stories. And I just fell in love with his approach, his concern for people, his sincerity, his sense of higher meaning and purpose in medicine that wasn't just diagnose, treat, increase the blood pressure medication, decrease the blood pressure medication. So at the end of the second or third class, I asked him, can I shadow you? Can I go to your office? He said, absolutely. So on my way home, literally on my way home, I would walk back and forth to school every day, was his office between the medical school and my apartment. And I would go to his office, which was on an old campus, which had been, I think, like a monastery or some kind of a colonial town. I don't know what it was exactly, with little houses that had all been kept up beautifully with fireplaces inside and internal staircases, wooden staircases going up to the second floor, like literally like homes. And he had his office there facing a garden on the first floor with windows. He had a fireplace, a rocking chair, a board to draw on, toys on the floor, carpets. It was like going into an old Little House on the Prairie cottage. And he would sit there in his rocking chair and just chat with kids. How things going with you? What's happening in school? What's your mother been up to? And I said, this is what I want to do. This is how I want to practice medicine. This is cool. I get paid to do this. This is amazing. So that was my first semester in medical school. I fell in love with it. I decided right then and there, I'm going to go into psychiatry. I'm going to specialize in child psychiatry. And from there, I never looked back.
Wow. I mean, that's really cool to have that mentor that popped up into your life right away to lead, because for most people it's a struggle, and even some of them start off and, it's switching residencies, etc. So that's awesome. I really like that.
So the first question that comes to my mind, because I've seen it so much in my own practice, and I've been caught up in it, years ago, I would definitely practice primary care different than I did 20 years ago. So do you prescribe much for kids? Because, we came through this, the mid 90s and the early 2000s, where we'd be seeing kids and they're on, 3 or 4 different psychotropic medications. And I'm like, these are developing minds. These are not mature brains. Like, this can't possibly be the way to control a child's behavior. Like, there has to be a better way.
It's a very difficult question to answer, because I think there's so many factors involved. It's so complicated. I would say my direction has been to move more and more towards what I call the support of the three-legged stool of good mental health, which is sleep, diet, and exercise, and away from pharmaceutical products. However, I do believe that pharmaceutical products have their place. They have their place in 2 areas, I believe. One is as a sort of a crutch, so a artificial support for a weakened mind while you're working on shoring up that stool and getting the environment to a state of readiness, health, strength, and overall goodness. And then in the second case, I think drugs have their place in psychiatry for children when it comes to really severe mental illness. Now, of course, the argument and the debate is, well, what is actually severe mental illness, and what is, let's say, environmental consequences of abuse, trauma? And that's a really tough question to answer, because there's so much involved. There really is a lot of genetics involved in mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD. All of that is genetically determined for the most part, not entirely, but largely speaking. At the same time, environment plays a huge role. There's a lot of studies that have shown that schizophrenia is not evenly distributed across populations and can shift if you take a child from one geographical area with the same genetics and move to a different one. There's some areas in Japan, for example, that have almost no schizophrenia, and yet they have really strong community ties. These people live in the same towns for their entire lifetime. And there are other areas where schizophrenia is high and there's very little social bonding and community, which shows that there's probably a social environmental factor that plays really greatly into the development of schizophrenia. Also, diet, huge. People who eat a lot of fish and fish oils and omega-3 fatty acids, they tend to have lower rates of schizophrenia. So in Northern Europe, for example, or in Japan, very, very low rates. Other places that have very, very low fish products tend to have higher rates. These are just 2 examples, there's hundreds. So you can actually make changes to disease process by changing environment. So I've always thought of child psychiatry as treating an oncoming meteor, which is directed towards Earth, you can wait until the kid is 15, 17, 20, 22 years old and then try to blow it up with an atomic bomb when it's 2 miles off of the planet. Or you can try to nudge it when it's 200,000 miles and light years, whatever, away, by making really small modifications to the environment that will then hopefully accumulate over time and overwhelm whatever that genetic predisposition is, which is to crash onto the earth, right? So I try to attack problems with as many tools as I can. I'm not a purist. I'm not an ideologue. I do not subscribe to the all drugs are bad. Let's never use pharmaceuticals ever again. Everything has to be taken from the earth and natural. I think that's naive and foolish. However, I also do not subscribe to the let's just find a drug cure for everything and ignore all these other factors. I'm trying to think of drugs as a tool, and I'm trying to use the good, best, most healthy tool I can. And in some cases, it is a pharmaceutical product. But as I said, to get back to the very beginning of my response to your question, I am overall trying to move more and more away from the pharmaceutical toolbox as the primary directed driver of good mental health and use it as minimally as I can without just tossing it out completely.
So I want to know, in your training, was it something that started to be, I won't say taught, but that you sort of picked up on that? Or is it you've changed your shift in your focus while you're out on your own practice just from seeing? Because there's been a big swing in the pendulum, you know, from when we were in school. It's just like throw a pill at everything. You know, it's like, oh, you're not feeling great, take some Prozac. Your brain needs rebalancing because you're home. Versus now, I think all aspects of medicine, from, you know, rheumatology and autoimmune disease to mental health, is focusing on the what you said, the key factors of sleep and physical exercise, diet, and social impact from your community and spirituality. So is this something you kind of just figuring out now, or is it kind of part of your training that they were like, yeah, maybe you should be cautious on what you're prescribing, especially to kids and youth?
Because until the 60s, there were no drugs in psychiatry. It was entirely therapy based and really analytic. Sanitariums, places where people would go to just relax and talk to psychiatrists for weeks or months or years were the primary forms of treatment for all psychiatric illness. And then the Prozac revolution occurred on the heels of the chlorpromazine antipsychotic, anti-schizophrenia, anti-bipolar phase in medicalization of psychiatry. And all the serious mental illnesses and the minor ones, so schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and anxiety and depression, all then had these go-to drugs that could be used. And they became very popular, and they supplanted therapy. And by the time I was in medical school, there had been really very little emphasis for about 20 years in therapeutic interventions and approaches to psychiatric illness or even psychiatric instability. So I had to seek out on my own in medical school supervisors who would help guide me towards the including of therapeutic interventions as well as medication. I didn't need any help in finding the medication treatments. That was part of the core curriculum. In residency, I did the same. All my supervisors were analytically trained. I was going to workshops, seminars, courses at the local analytic institute to get additional therapy training and then ultimately analytic training after I completed residency, so that I could do both. I could be a therapist and I could be a medication pharmacologist. And that was what I decided I would do soon after I got free of the medical establishment. However, since then, I've actually done a second revolution, which is to learn and discover, primarily after 2020, when the analytic institutes all ran for the hills, just like everyone else in medicine, lacking courage, no strength, complete pussification of the entire mental health industry. That included analysts who I really revered for decades because I thought they were the courageous fighters fighting against the emotional maelstrom of the malcontents and the neurotics and the psychotics. Well, they were just as pussified as everyone else. They ran away, they shut down their practices, they turned virtual, they they kill their CME programs. They turn their backs on the candidates. And 3 years later, now 2023, they're still doing it. So I actually completely abandoned my entire candidacy. I left the Institute. I turned my back on analysis. I have no confidence or faith in their ethics, their morals, or their courage. And I began a completely different and more radical approach to treatment, which includes almost exclusively the emphasis on action rather than on insight. And what I mean by that is analysis, deep therapy is based entirely on insight. It's learning about yourself, discovering your inner truth, who you are, what drives you emotionally, as if that's going to change everything about you and your life. Well, it doesn't unless you do something about it. You can learn a lot. You can be Woody Allen in analysis for 35 years, know everything about you, and still be an erotic freak and go through 17 women and then, marry the girl that you adopted when you're 60 years old. So,
whoa, you say that like it's a bad thing.
Oh, stop.
I'm trying to imagine a universe where that would be a good thing, and I can't think of it.
No, so am I.
So important. And I really came to this conclusion definitively in 2020 when I realized that so many people out there, they understand, they have insight, they get it, but they do nothing about it. It doesn't matter what you think, how you feel, what you know, if you don't take action. And inversely, it doesn't take a lot to be courageous. All it takes is a decision to act in spite of fear when you're at risk of losing something. That's the definition of courage. That's all it is. You don't have to train. You don't have to learn. You just have to say, you know what? I'm going to do A and risk losing B, even though I feel scared. That's it. Done. Anybody can do that. So I started to preach that to my patients who had been just stuck in these ruts for years and years and years, never changing, developing and growing internally, but their lives didn't change. They still had bad marriages. They were still alone. They were still fat. They were still miserable, even though they knew everything about themselves. And I started to emphasize taking action, doing something, even if it's going outside and taking a walk for 20 minutes, even if it's skipping breakfast and doing an intermittent fast, even if it's, as a young man who can't date, walking around outside, and the first thing you do in the morning is you say hello to the first 3 people you meet on the street to connect so that you can reach out and develop social interactions, little things like that. And I found that those made such a bigger difference in people's physical and emotional well-being than sitting and talking for hours on end, that now my whole practice is really geared towards the 3-legged stool of good mental health, sleep, diet, and exercise, and putting knowledge into action, even if it's small little bites, and then slowly but surely changing your external world and how you interact in it so that you then feel better. In other words, going from the outside in rather than the inside out, because I think your actions, not only do they determine and speak to your character, they also change you. If you eat differently, if you walk differently, if you speak differently, it doesn't matter how you feel about it. That is totally irrelevant. You will then become different inside and you will feel differently. You will stop being scared, sad, and depressed because you are acting differently. So I've almost gone full circle from analytic model to behavioral model. And I know it sounds crazy, but I think it's actually more effective.
Well, I think, this is amazingly timely for what I've been listening to in podcasts over the last week. I've listened to a couple of Jordan Peterson's podcasts, and the emphasis on the last 2 interviews that I listened to were this whole concept of, if you choose to do something difficult and you keep doing it, that is the most psychologically enhancing activity you can provide, you can do. So it's not somebody making you do something hard, but if you're like, I'm going to run a 5K or I'm going to run a marathon, and you choose to do that, that changes
Correct.
everything else in your life as well. And, in the book, The Power of Habit, I forget the name of the author, but he calls it sentinel habits. Some people quit smoking and all their relationships get better and they lose 50 pounds and they get a different job. And because they never thought they could do the thing, the quitting smoking. And then when they see that, they're like, if I can do that, I can do anything. And it really, I love this because it's this call to action. Mm-hmm. And it's exactly what happened. Like, when I am so unbelievably disgusted and disappointed with my physician colleagues, and it wasn't that they necessarily disagreed with my stance 180 degrees. Some did, but most, they might have agreed almost with most of what we did, but they went along with the bullshit because it was easy. And they didn't want to be an outlier, and they saw whack-a-mole going on with people on social media, and they just didn't want any part of that. And I'm like,
yeah, they didn't exemplify any courage, which is what we were talking about.
I completely agree with that.
Yeah. So, I want to get into this part of the thing, especially about kids, and really hearing you speak in Ocala, which we were talking about, really hit home for me and Tim, and it was your talk was the highlight for us of the whole weekend. I mean, the pinnacle point. I mean, whole thing was
Pierre Corey saying, "Don't fucking comply."
Yeah,
that was
good too.
That was good too, but in a different way.
There was a lot of good things, but what you talked about, the sort of pussifying of the nation and what's happening to our kids through the pandemic, how they've been affected through the pandemic, and how we need to protect our kids, and really we need to be there for them because they're the future. Let's get into that. Like, first of all,
men. Tell us about men. I think we should start there, because that really is one of the central themes. Like, men have been beat up, and they're it's not father knows best, it's father's a dipshit and we should laugh at him. That's been the popular media for the last 20 years. And so we went from this thing in the 50s where dad was the caring nurturer provider for the family to he's a bumbling dumbass that drinks too much, or
we don't need men and we can just have
two
moms.
You don't need men, you just need the Barbie movie, right? And but yet at the same time we say we don't need men because of toxic masculinity. We have this other side where young women are the ones most affected by this trans virus. So we don't need women either, because they can chop their breasts and genitals off and become men, and young boys can participate against women in women's sports or even in collegiate sports amazingly. And that's okay. So we really don't need women, and we sure shit don't need men. So like, what are you experiencing? Like, you're in Los Angeles, for heaven's sake. So like, please give us some insight into what
American men have become pussies. I spent about a month traveling on a boat through Central and Southeastern Europe last summer with Dennis Prager, his wife, Alan Estrin, his producer, and Alan's wife, Jeff Barkey, my co-podcast host, and about 150 other older but vital, courageous, strong, ethical, wonderful Americans who chose to make this trip to see the life of really what America was in the 1950s. And that is what Central and Eastern Europe is today. It's America in the 1950s, largely speaking. Talking about Hungary, talking about Croatia, talking about Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Moldova. These are places where people are still fighting for what they believe in. They're fighting for their values, their church, their family. They're fighting against big government. They have strong communities that are all based on voluntary choices, not communalism, but community. These are people who are now just getting cars, refrigerators, electronics, growing and modernizing, and knowing that in order to get that, they have to work for it. The men are men. They are speaking out for themselves, their families, their wives. They are going after what they want, and that includes women, and they are expressing their desires. And women are women. Women are expressing their femininity through their dress, through their flirtation, through their receptivity to male pursuits. And they love it. And the children are watching this dance going on between men and women and thinking, wow, I can't wait for the day that I become a big, strong man or a beautiful young woman so that I can play in this dance as well and fulfill and grow what distinguishes me as a man and as a woman. That doesn't exist in the US anymore. And I mention this because a lot of people don't realize that this still exists in other parts of the world. And it existed in the US 2-3 generations ago. We just forgot about it because it hasn't been present for so long. I say men are pussies today because they lack the 4 fundamental qualities of mandom, of being a man. And those are physical strength, courage, honor, and mastery. We have attacked all 4 of those qualities, which are essential to being a man, for several decades now. It didn't just start in 2020. It started a long time earlier, and I traced the outline, the seeds of that in my book, my first book, United States of Fear. It started in the 60s and the 70s with the peace movement, the feminist movement, the est movement of self-esteem, and the attacks against church, against depriving oneself and sacrificing for something good, for deferring gratification, for thinking outside in terms of gratitude and selflessness and giving, and focusing on the self, narcissism. All of that contributed to this ultimate point on the number line where we are right now, where we just don't have masculinity at all. And we don't have it exemplified in our movies, our media, as you mentioned, these TV shows that have been going on now for probably 25 years. Father Knows Best disappeared when I was in high school and was replaced with Married with Children. And that was in 1986.
Exactly.
So this is not new, but it completely exploded. Yeah. And now, as you correctly pointed out, we're seeing the consequences, not just for men, but also for women. I can't tell you the number of young girls, young women that come to me in my practice bereft of any hope of ever finding a man, of having a date, much less getting married, having a child. They feel unattractive, undesirable. Men don't look at them. Men don't court them. Men don't compliment them. They would love, even though they won't say it in public, they would love for a man to walk by, check them up and down and say, wow, looking pretty good today. They would love that. They say that they don't like that, but then when men don't pay attention to them, they think, what am I? Am I fat? Am I ugly? They immediately lose any sense of value and self-esteem. They're cutting. They're looking at social media. They're comparing themselves to other women online. They're finding themselves wanting. They're lonely. And because they're spending all their time in their profession, following the feminist movement of getting a job, going up the corporate ladder, getting a PhD, pushing marriage back until you're 35, 38, 40, 42, until it's so late biologically that you're unlikely to ever have a child, and you're past your so-called prime in terms of the dating market, that men are just going to be looking at younger women now because they have that option. You're going to be alone for the rest of your life. And I see this as well with middle-aged women. I mean, the whole gamut, young, adolescent, young adult, middle-aged women, they're all miserable. They're more depressed than ever. The diagnosis rate of anxiety and the treatment with anxiolytics has never been higher in the history of the country, according to the Pew Research report published 3 years ago, even higher than it was in the 60s and 70s. And all of these so-called liberal free rights for all, emancipation of women crowd keep attacking the 1950s as this place of savagery, where women were imprisoned and locked in their homes and unable to get out into the workforce. Look at the mental health rates compared to today from back in the 50s. Women were actually happy. They were delighted. They loved their lives by and large. They do not now. That in itself should be empirical proof that this is absolutely the wrong direction to go, and that redefining masculinity as toxic and telling women that their prize should be a 16-digit acronym after their name and a PhD and a job is not only deceitful and a lie, it is actually destructive and abusive. We will not ever recover our society. We will not survive. I mean, literally, we will not reproduce if this does not get stopped and reversed very quickly.
So I guess that was the whole thing I'm thinking is, how do we stop it, put the brakes on and try to reverse that?
Since you're not working in medicine anymore, I think the solution is you bring me a pipe and a martini every night when I get home. Obviously, Dr. McDonald said action is the way you change your
my
mood.
brain's still in the co-sharing of the dishes.
Oh boy, we're not only getting a great podcast, we're getting free therapy.
Well, he's listening anyway. I don't know if it's therapy, but
yeah.
But what do we do? How do we, because I mean, it seems like such an overwhelming, daunting task. I mean, people like Tim and I can share values with other people, our kids, our community, our church groups, but it just gets nuts. And then we'll get into the part about the whole transgenderism thing. Even in a small town where we were working, well, I'd never heard of a trans person until I started my career, and kind of got surprised when Bill came in for his pap smear, and I'm like, there's a mistake. Someone booked this incorrectly. This is in the early 90s. Why is Bill coming in for a pap smear? And Bill had transitioned from a woman. And I was like, what? And now, literally in a small town of under 10,000, I'm seeing all these people that are transitioning, kids who are, 10-year-olds that want to be referred to as a male name instead of their female gender because they're interested in football. And by gosh, a female girl can't like football or hockey, so I must be a male, and the parents are going along with it. Like, it's all friggin' messed up. And so, like, how do we even start other than just calling BS on all this?
I mean, acknowledging that it is BS. We have to acknowledge the reality that this is utter fantasy and utter destruction. And that requires some courage. To speak the truth today makes you courageous. It makes you a dissident. It makes you potentially part of the solution. And until more people are willing to stand up and say the emperor has no clothes, and that the empress has a penis, therefore he's an emperor, not an empress, we cannot do anything. I tell my patients when they come in, first time, new evaluation, we must agree on a fundamental reality. I'm not going to enter into your psychotic fantasies as a way of joining you or affirming you or colluding with you, which is what affirmation is. It's collusion, because that would actually harm you. And that's something I refuse to do. I will not harm you as my physician, as your physician. If I start to harm you, then I've given up my ethical obligation to be of service to you. So that's something we have to agree on right away. And I would like for all Americans, not only physicians, to honor that pledge as well, to state clearly to themselves and to the people around them, I will only honor reality. I will no longer affirm, I will no longer pretend that the naked emperor is actually clothed. I think that has to be our starting point. And then from there, we have to do what it takes to reverse the causes of what brought us and led us to this position to begin with. And that would be returning to a strong, unequivocal affirmation of masculinity. And that means as parents, we must model and teach that, both modeling and teaching explicitly to our children in every aspect of life, in the way we treat each other as husbands and wives, in what we say is good and bad, in pointing out where it's not present to our children. That's what parents do. They model and they teach. And we stopped doing that because we got scared. We knew that it was wrong to go against traditional masculinity. We knew that it was wrong to push our daughters into PhD programs and jobs at the expense of relationships and marriage and children. We knew it, but we just didn't really have the balls to say it. We just thought, yeah, it'll sort of autocorrect. Well, we don't really want people to think that we're not sensitive, we're not progressive, that we're not on the right side of history. So we'll just let it go for now. We'll fix that later. Well, yeah, look what happened. So we've got to stand up and we've got to say the truth. That's the first thing we have to do.
Are you looking for alternative investments and tangible assets that help you build and protect your wealth while empowering your financial future? Look no further than Eckhart Enterprises. With over 37 years of experience in the industry, Eckhart Enterprises is your trusted partner in the world of alternative investments and asset management. They have a track record of success with more than 1,300 investors on board and over $700 million in capital invested in tangible assets.
Their specialty lies in offering immediate cash flow opportunities through mineral rights investments so that you don't have to wait decades to see your investments pay off. Their unique AML approach, born from decades of experience, focuses on aggregating, maturing, and liquidating assets strategically to maximize returns. Join Eckert Enterprises. Visit EckertEnterprises.com, spelled ECKARD enterprises.com today to begin your journey toward building and protecting your financial future.
For more information about alternative investments and asset management, visit EckertEnterprises.com. And remember, Eckert Enterprises is your gateway to tangible assets and lasting financial success. Contact Eckert today.
For more information about alternative investments and asset management, visit EckertEnterprises.com, spelled ECKARDENTERPRISES.com. And remember, Eckert Enterprises is your gateway to tangible assets and lasting financial success. Contact Eckert today.
Absolutely. So in that vein, let's go back through the kind of four pillars of masculinity, because I think that's really important for the listeners to kind of grasp this definition, because it's been lost. I mean, you say four pillars of masculinity and it's like professional wrestling, a jacked up pickup truck, a gun, and a fishing rod. Yeah. You know, I mean, that's kind of where we came from in rural Oregon. And I think there's more to it than that. We had the pleasure of interviewing Brant Hansen, and one of his books is Why We Need Men. And he writes it as, you know, from the perspective of an avid indoorsman. You know, he doesn't do man stuff. Like, he doesn't hunt, he doesn't fish. He goes to the gym, he takes very good care of himself. But his thing was very biblically based. And he said, you know, man was made to protect his family and tend the garden. You know, so man is a protector and a nurturer at the same time. But he's not a nurturer the way women are. He's protecting the garden. He's providing fruit for people to consume. He's hunting. He's gathering. He's the provider,
he resources,
and protector. And yes, so that's, I mean, I guess that would be the mastery part of what you had talked about. You know, this idea of being really skilled at something, that used to be a really big deal. Like, you were a skilled surgeon, you were a skilled craftsman, you know, you built the best boats on the East Coast or whatever. And a lot of that's just, you know, you're pointing Instagram
out
likes or something, I guess.
I would call it a manufacturing economic cancer, which will need to be reversed as well, before I go back to those 4 points again, which is that men no longer do manual labor. They sit in front of desks and computers. And this is problematic in many ways. It's physically problematic, makes them fat, less muscle tissue, lower sperm counts, less virile. It is also poor in a psychological way, because it detaches themselves from the product of their labor. So they don't see any results of what they're doing that they can touch and feel. They don't see anything that they've built, that they've cut, that they've killed, that they've culled, that they've destroyed. That is what makes men in terms of their work. And so we've really separated so many degrees, men and their work. And that's the whole societal redress that needs to be made. The man who does this show, Dirty Jobs, talks about this a lot. This is a huge problem with masculinity. Men do not do the dirty jobs. And it's not just dirty jobs, it's manual labor, the skilled labor. And this is a problem for our security, because without people to build roads and pipes and bridges and electronics and plumbing, we rely on imported labor. And if we don't produce the parts to make that, which we don't do anymore either, because it all comes from China, now we're dependent on foreign labor and foreign parts to keep ourselves going, literally to keep our country alive. And without the men and the parts, we're at risk of having everything cut off, and then we become essentially vassals to foreign state. Now, that has nothing to do with masculinity per se. It has to do with a country's survival from an economic manufacturing point of view. But getting back to the psychological, the individual necessity of masculinity and the four pillars, I highly recommend the book, The Way of Men by Jack Donovan, who wrote about these four pillars. I did not invent them, he did. And they are physical strength, courage, honor, and mastery. And it's very important to note that these four qualities are not virtuous necessarily. They're not necessarily good in the moral sense. They are amoral. They are absent of morality, not immoral, amoral. Meaning, A mafioso exhibits these 4 characteristics. Think of the Godfather: strong, courageous, meaning he's willing to risk himself and his life for what he believes in, which is probably money and drugs, and influence. Honor is the family. He protects his family. That's very honorable. And mastery, he's very good at killing, at assassinations, at financial bribery and gambling. He's good at this stuff. But this is a bad man. So I want to make it very clear to your listeners that these 4 pillars of masculinity do not make you a good man. They make you a man. How do you become a good man is an entirely separate question, and that requires virtue, and that is culturally and temporally dependent. These 4 qualities are culturally and temporally independent. Any tribe, village, country, over all periods of time, anywhere in the world, universally espouses these 4 characteristics to define a man. However, a good man is defined by a place and time and a culture that follows the biblical traditions and the values and virtues that the United States was founded on. And that is a separate proposition that must be interwoven with these 4 characteristics so that masculinity does not become toxic and instead becomes virtuous.
I love it. And here, so the next step question after that is, okay, so I listened to your recent podcast where you had Riley Gaines on, who was the collegiate swimmer who stood up protesting against
Leah, L-I-A. I don't know what his real name is, but he goes by Leah.
Leah, yeah, it's Leah. Yeah, and so I think everybody knows that story by now. But so she, speaks up. She is not a clinician. She's was 21, right, at the time that it happened.
When a guy is walking around with a boner in the women's change room saying that he's a girl, you don't need to be a clinician to figure out that that's probably
no. My point being, what she said is her coaches didn't speak up. Everyone just kind of smiled, and so here she is. She's having to speak up, and she's now known for taking a stand. And Chloe Cole, who is detransition, is taking a stand, and so everyday, I could just say everyday people. They're not medical. They're not clinicians. They're having the courage, and they're standing up and they're calling BS on all this. What about the medical community? Like in our experience, I'm disgusted and I'm pissed off, and I'm ashamed to be associated with all these people in the name of science that learn biology and genetics, and now they're just going along with it. And as I always say, this is like the new lobotomy of the 2000s, where it's like, oh yeah,
it's worse.
Right. It's worse.
It's worse. At least with lobotomies, generally speaking, you were doing surgeries on really, really profoundly disturbed people that were less disturbed after their lobotomy. They were also probably largely, mentally disabled. But at the same time, these were really sick people. And there's kind of this desperation to do something. You're taking the healthiest people in your society.
You're mutilating kids.
Versus, primary intervention. Totally different.
Right. And so, I see this stuff on TV, and it's like the medical establishment now is like, well, it's define whatever you feel like being, and no one will define a man anymore. And it's all just upside down. And what do you think of the medical profession? And it's like, how sick is this that it's people like Riley Gaines that have to speak out, and people like Chloe Cole that have to say, look what happened to me. And the rest of us that are going along with it, pediatricians and the surgeons mutilating these kids. Like, how do we reverse that? How do we, I don't know.
People. One is finance. There is an underlying motivation across the entire medical establishment, from top to bottom, right to left, medical, non-medical, to make money by castrating and mutilating children as young as possible, in order to provide a guaranteed taxpayer-funded revenue stream for the rest of this victim's life. That is what is driving this, largely speaking. The surgeries cost fortunes, tens of thousands of dollars. The drugs are expensive and they are lifelong, like immunosuppressive drugs. You can't stop them after 5 or 10 years. They are not once and done. They are for the rest of your life. And then all of the necessary medical complications from these drugs and surgeries, which are unavoidable because you're damaging healthy bodies, requires further surgical interventions, further drugs, as well as therapies in order to keep these people going. That is very lucrative. And if you're able to force the government through the confiscation of money called taxes to pay for these at the risk of losing licenses, losing grants, losing eligibility to provide care, and that would be insurance companies that are being legally obligated to pay for these procedures at the risk of being held to anti-discriminatory civil rights prosecutions. Now you've got a guaranteed multi-billion-dollar industry that nobody has any competition with, nobody can fight against. It's like the billions of dollars in money that was given to Pfizer and Moderna for these forced mRNA injections with no liability. As proof of this, look what happened 2 years ago in Florida when Ron DeSantis, the governor, tried to block government taxpayer funding for transition surgeries. And there was this enormous uproar. Yeah. Why? Because they knew, the pro-transition people, the pro-trans people knew that they absolutely must have private insurance and government funded complete approval for all of these surgeries and treatments, because they'll never make the money through private surgeries like, say, nose jobs and boob jobs do, which are not government funded and there's no taxpayer money involved. They're all elective. So in other words, this whole trans movement within the medical community must go from elective to obligatory, paid for by the government through prison systems, through schools. All the public government institutions must be funded to provide these surgeries. And that has to be encoded into law, like what's happening in California, where the laws are now obligating the prison system to provide these surgeries and move male prisoners into female prisons, and federal statutes that must go after, through the Attorney General, anybody in any institution that tries to block this on civil rights grounds. This must become a civil rights issue. So this is all financial. All the civil rights bullshit, this is all an umbrella to get pushed through the financial success of these surgeries. That's the first important point that most people don't realize. It's not just a political issue, it's a financial one. The second, and this is something many people don't realize either, and this is really scary and ironic, given what you just said about the fact that most of the people standing up are girls and women, is this: the primary human drivers for this horrific, almost like a slave sex trade in terms of its horror, which is the mutilation of children and the chemical castration of young girls, it's almost entirely driven by women. All of the therapists, teachers, surgeons, clinicians, clinical administrators, hospital administrators, everybody that's pushing this, it's almost entirely women. And this is really crazy because the primary victims of this are girls and young women. So it's almost like the sex is eating itself alive. It's not men that are largely pushing for the trans movement. It's women, and women doctors and women therapists and women teachers. So this is a really important point. Nobody realizes this. They think that this is perhaps something that men are trying to push. No, it's women trying to destroy themselves. So we have to acknowledge these two empirical facts before we can then develop a strategy to counter it, because without acknowledging this, I don't think people really are facing the gravity of the catastrophe that's unfolding.
So that's
interesting, because I'm just thinking back to what I've experienced in my career and thinking about the first person that I saw, which was years ago, that was transitioning a patient from female to male, and all the pushback and flack I got from my colleagues because I wouldn't administer the hormones. And this is back in 2005, 6, 7. It was unusual.
Exactly.
But pushback was from all my female colleagues. It's like, well, you got to do it. It's your patient if that's what they wish. And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't perform abortions. They can go else. But all the pushback
they're
I got
driving
was from
it.
women. Interesting.
So, but this thing that's so fascinating is it's kind of this self-loathing. And you know, I've always prided myself in kind of being the big picture person. So if you think, if you agree that women's primary role is the, you know, the carrying and nurturing of children, because men can't do that. And but then, like, look at where the women's movement.
Oh yes, they can
has,
now.
Yeah, well, whatever has gone.
To get that in there.
You know, it started with the whole, what I call the holy sacrament of leftism, which is abortion, right? I mean, so you're literally sacrificing your young so you can be more like a male. You can be unfettered from sexual dalliance. You can be unfettered from having to have a child and care for them so that you can get your PhD or do your super mega residency or fellowship or whatever the case may be, or pursue business. So it's making you more male in a sense. And that was, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you know, men and women should be equal, and the great equalizer is abortion. Well, that's where it started. But now it's starting with, well, the great equalizer is we just don't need women at all. and I can't not think that. Like, it really is this self-loathing of what womanness is. And it's so beautiful. We have 2 great kids. I can't even begin to imagine what it was like to have, you know, our son or our daughter, like, growing inside your body. But May can. She can try to describe that to me. But it's so unique and powerful, and yet we're trying to extinguish that. It's just,
I would agree disgusting. With
you. Oh, there's the power tools now. The little power tools in the background. We can hear a little bit, but that's okay. They're
productive men.
That is true. They're getting
right.
shit done.
I love it.
Women. Your point is well taken. Women, I believe, are largely, this is not entirely the case, because there's some ideological perversion among young women that they just sort of been pulled along for the ride. But the ones that are driving the trans movement, the ones that are really leading the way, the Anthony Fauci's, let's say, of the whole movement, the truly sociopathic evil characters, they are driven, I believe, by a belief that there should be no support, expression, or lauding of femininity at all. So every expression of femininity, which starts from pregnancy and birth and breastfeeding and caretaking, is decried as oppressive. And what would be the fastest way to remove that? Well, it would be sterilization, wouldn't it? It would be removing breasts so that no breastfeeding can physiologically occur. It would be eliminating all of the feminine features of the body through hormones. It would be changing the voice permanently to alter it and lower the pitch. It would be cutting the hair. All of these physiologic changes that trans medicine is moving towards is essentially an attack on the feminine. And the people that are pushing it, which, as I said earlier, are primarily women, are driven by a self-loathing, as you used that phrase, and I think it's accurate, to destroy the feminine. It's not coming from men. It's coming from women. And so what that means is that one of the consequences, as I said earlier, of the attack on masculinity has not only been the destruction of the man, it's been the destruction of the woman. And the reason for that is that femininity cannot exist in a vacuum without the presence of masculinity. Femininity is only defined in its complementariness to masculinity. If you have no men, you have no feminine. This Wonder Woman fantasy island that we saw with Gal Gadot a few years ago, where these super hot, sexy, big chested Amazon women were running around fighting one another, that's a freaking joke. These women would never be so hot and sexy without men around. They would devolve into some kind of animalistic species. Women are not hot and sexy when men are not around, because that's how they define themselves as hot and sexy and feminine, is by the way that men react to them. And without that, they don't have anything to push back against. They don't have anything to define themselves as different from. So this is the sad endpoint to the assassination of the man. It ultimately assassinates the woman, physiologically and in the terms of the feminine expression. So we're doing women no favors by going after men. We are actually encouraging more of this trans nonsense and destroying the feminine definition of the body, the heart, the mind, the relationship. We are extinguishing our species by redefining the man as toxic.
Yeah, no, it just reminds me of one of my best friends. His daughter's 30 years old now, and I remember they were visiting us when she was about 2.5 or 3, and she was running around in this white dress that they found someplace, at a costume store. And she's like, "Do you love my wedding dress? Do you love my wedding dress?" And it's like she has no concept of really, what a wedding is or any of the details of that. But some part of her soul knew that that's what being a girl was. You grow up, you get married, you have a family, which is exactly what she did. And she has a wonderful husband and 3 beautiful little girls. And it's so awesome to see that. But like that started in the womb. I mean, it's so imprinted in who we are that this whole concept of that somehow I know what it would be like, A, to feel like a woman, and B, giving me different drugs and surgeries would actually matter. Like
you just pointed
beyond
something out really
insanity.
important. I didn't even think about this until you just said it, which is the intrinsic, almost genetically present basal fantasy of the girl, of the ultimately the woman, which is the Disney fantasy. I don't think Disney created this fantasy out of nothing. I think Disney put words to a primal fantasy. And this is why Disney has now gone full circle, as it got taken over by the trans left, to destroy the expression of that fantasy. Because to the extent that girls grow up with a language to express and follow and play with this primal fantasy, which would be the princess, the marriage, the wedding gown, to the extent that they have these tools that they learn by watching these Disney movies and these books taken away from them and replaced with, I want to be, a tough butch lesbian when I grow up, Disney fantasy. We as a society will have succeeded in erasing the feminine aspiration from little girls. I think this is intentional. And they're doing it under the rationalization or the guise, I would say that the cloak really of inclusivity and anti-patriarchy and anti-misogyny and all this nonsense, which this is all a smoke cloud. This is all a lie. The real goal is to destroy the natural progression of the girl to the young woman to the woman by eliminating, like in Fahrenheit 455, where they just burned the books. If you eliminate the substrate of the fantasy in the environment, then the fantasy, they hope will eventually just disappear. Now, you can't completely eliminate it. You can only suppress it. But if you suppress it well enough, you'll eventually have a society where nobody's reproducing because they've sort of forgotten what it means. And then we wind up with, completely crashing fertility rates and an aging population that has no skill set and women who have no ability to attract men. And then we don't have kids at all. And this is kind of the ultimate end game. I would say this, as I wrote in my Substack, which is also called Dissident MD a while back, I think it's my second or third most read Substack after American Women Are Undateable, which is my number one viewed Substack, which says a lot, right? American Women Are Undateable, number one read Substack article I've written in 2 years. So my number 2 or number 3 is titled Death, the Logical Progression of Transgenderism. Because I think this is the end goal. Let's get, you want to go meta, you want to go high picture, like the top of all of this conversation. This is where it is. Transgenderism leads to death. I don't mean the individual's death. I mean the death of the species. Transgenderism's logical endpoint is the extinction of humanity, of human beings. That is where we're going. That is how serious this is.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it just logically makes sense. I mean,
yeah. If you stare, well, I read an article this morning, and it was they were quoting the Club of Rome and a bunch of the WEF people, and their goal was to reduce fertility by 80% by 2100 or something like that. So we would go from
CDC and the EU and the UN and all these alphabet soup organizations, national and international. That's why they all love transgenderism, because it goes right along, it folds right in parallel with their master plan, which is reduction of population and a takeover by a small group of elite individuals of everything, every process, every valuable asset of the earth. I mean, that is kind of why this is all moving together, why everybody has got their backs on all these different groups, because their interests are aligned ultimately.
Yeah, they said they wanted, in raw numbers, I think it was, they wanted to go from 124 million births a year, which is kind of where we are now, to 24 million births a year, which is just like, I mean, that's straight down. You're flying the airplane into the side of the mountain.
They want extinction
at that stage.
ultimately.
Yeah, because you shall eat the bugs and you
this
will
is why
like
it's
them.
evil.
Yes, yeah.
You know, we don't have
That's
to
right.
argue about politics and use all these sort of contemporary distinguishing words to get to the crux of this issue. I've said for 3 years now, since 2020, let's stop arguing about scientific rationales for pore sizes for masks and for the potential for oxygen deprivation. It's all true. It's all true. But it's beside the point. It's a distraction. Let's get to the core issue, which is morality. Good and bad, right and wrong. That's really what we're fighting for. It's not about politics. It's not even about really science, ultimately. It's about whether we can achieve moral clarity. If we don't achieve moral clarity on all of these issues, fundamentally, it doesn't matter if we win the freedom battle, we win the medical science battle, we win the parental rights battle, the homeschooling battle. These are important battles. I'm not making fun of them or belittling them, but I'm saying that they are subservient to the battle. I would say the war. Let's say the war. We had to have battles, but the war is really over moral clarity. If we don't win that war, we can win all these little battles and we'll still lose the war, because ultimately they are all subsumed by that higher level fight, which is to clarify what is moral, what is immoral, what is virtuous, what is not. We have allowed the left to take that over. We've allowed the left to redefine our moral Bible. We've literally allowed them to rewrite our language. We don't have justice anymore. We have social justice. We don't have equality. We have equity. We don't have parental authority. We have affirmation. We have completely reversed course in our core logos, our language, how we communicate, how we think. And if we give that up, then we can't use the weapons, the tools, depending on whether you call it an argument or a war, of words to be able to clarify our positions morally. If we can't use language to state what we think, then our thoughts are lost. And then they take over our thoughts, our language, and ultimately our bodies, our communities, our government, our borders. That's where we're heading right now. And if I think 60% of the country knows what's right and wrong, but they're starting to become confused about it and unable to voice it, 10% are evil and they should be exterminated. And then the other, or at least in prison for life, and then the other 20% that are left, those are the people like us that are thinking and feeling and expressing clearly what is right and wrong and trying to coax the other 60% over to our side before that 10% completely eliminates humanity. That's kind of where we are in a nutshell.
So, it's interesting because it brings to mind, my two of my favorite people to quote are Jesus and Dave Mustaine. Dave Mustaine is the frontman for Megadeth. And in the song Holy Wars from, what was that, like 1981? The end of the end of the song is pretty soon they'll take my thoughts away. And that's exactly
where we're going.
The direction we're going. And it's just, it's mind blowing how somebody in 1981 who used a ton of heroin can actually come up with some really cool stuff. But he's clean and sober now. But I digress. But it really is amazing. Pretty soon they'll take my thoughts away, and that's really what it's about. But if you're talking about moral clarity comes from spiritual discernment, which means people have to turn back to God. We have sacrificed the entire society on the cross of moral relativism, because moral relativism ends with no right and no wrong. No right and no wrong is utter chaos. I had a discussion almost 20 years ago with a medical student. I mean, this is a long time ago. And we had just seen a brand new infant. The family was just delighted. Their baby was super healthy. And she said, well, I don't really, somehow we got into some moral argument. And she was like, well, I don't really think that there's any actual moral absolutes. And I said, okay, that beautiful brand new 3-day-old baby we saw, if somebody went in there with a saw and hacked it up, you wouldn't say that that's morally absolutely wrong. Well, I would feel like that was the case, but actually, no, it wouldn't really be absolutely morally right or wrong. And you just sit there and you just go, okay, well,
this is the reason why secularism must really triumph over religion in order for the violent counter-revolution to succeed. You cannot win in exterminating humanity if religious values persist. This is the reason why the Aztecs, the Mayans, and the Incans gods are being worshipped in government schools right now, why children are repeating prayers in Teotitlan language to appease the sun god, because these civilizations were founded on human sacrifice as the method to control the environment. They worshiped nature. They didn't worship God. Nature was their God. If we can reinstitute, meaning go to pre-biblical times, not medieval, I mean pre-biblical times, then the left will have a complete open fast lane to conquer us. I don't think we can survive without an objective set of moral values, which come from essentially the Bible and Judeo-Christian religions. If we toss that, and we are on the verge of tossing it, everything becomes subjective, everything becomes open to determination by a human authority figure, which is always a dictator, always ends up that way. There's no exception in any period of history where it didn't. And at that point, we no longer have a external truth to orient towards. Everything literally becomes relative. And when it becomes relative, it can become controlled by a person. And most likely the person who's the most sociopathic and powerful then take control of that. This is the reason why the idea of using one's feelings, i.e. one's conscience, because they are kind of synonymous, is a horrible way to determine moral clarity. Many, many people who do terrible evil, murders, rapes, pillaging, they go to sleep at night with clear consciences. So this girl that you speak about from medical school who said, I would feel badly if the baby got hacked up, therefore it's not right, is completely missing the mark. What if she didn't feel that it wasn't right? What if she were like Hamas? What if she was jubilantly celebrating by taking the baby's mother's cell phone and using it to call her own mother to announce with giddy satisfaction, joy, and jubilation how delighted she was to have hacked up that horrible baby because babies need to die, and then had her mother say, thank goodness, honey, you were able to do that. Could you kill a few more for us? This feels really good. It feels great. That is literally what happened on October 7th in Israel with Hamas and the Gazan citizens, civilians, who wandered in after them. They murdered with completely clear consciences, jubilantly, with great pride and wonderful feeling. If we use that as our standard rather than actual biblical law or objective morality, where are we going to go? We're going to go into a actual hellscape of Gaza throughout the entire world. That's where this path leads.
Yes, you end up with exactly. It's just like how we went from the what was it, the Zaire commune that you lived in to Portland.
Yeah.
And so you go, it's like Gaza all over the world. And
without moral clarity, which is objective. As long as we continue to worship feelings, subjective experience, and ultimately our own narcissistic tendencies, we're not going to be able to get off of this bus heading towards the cliff. We can't. It's just not possible.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Outstanding.
Well, man, we could talk to you for hours, but we're running out of time.
But I do. Having talked to a psychiatrist for over an hour now, I feel so much lighter.
You do.
Lighter.
Yeah, I look
lighter.
Fresher. Yeah, right. I want to ask before we sort of wrap up, how did you give yourself the tell our audience how you gave yourself the name Dissident MD?
Very simple.
How you coined that term for yourself?
Because it's actually quite simple. Yeah. I realized in 2020, when I finished writing my book, I published it in 2021, United States of Fear, that any expression of a dissenting view today, and today meaning starting back around mid-2020, any expression of a dissenting view makes you a dissident. So I'm using it not only to define myself as holding a different view, but also to hopefully encourage others to be dissidents as well, because all you need to do is have a dissenting view. That's all you need to become a dissident. And a dissident is not a rebel. A dissident is someone who is speaking and acting and thinking in opposition to a government power. So it's a more refined version of a rebel. A rebel is just somebody who is pushing against something. But it doesn't really mean necessarily that rebels doing anything productive. A dissident is actually speaking out against a organized political power structure. And we should all become dissidents, because our political power structure and our media and our corporations as well, which are also political, let's just call it what it is, we should all be dissidents in expressing opposing views to that. And then secondly, taking action, which is what courage is, taking action to express your dissident views out in the world, putting yourself at some risk, depending on who you are and what you can risk, a small, moderate, or large risk, doesn't matter, but some risk. And if we can all become dissenting and courageous to some degree, we can start to turn this ship towards the proper direction. And that's what I want to encourage and hopefully inspire everyone to do. I can't do this on my own. We, the 20%, can't. We need the rest of America to come on board with being dissenting and being courageous, so that we can win this war.
This is just a wonderful place to wrap this up, because I love the call to action. It's kind of like, if you want to run, I used to run marathons. If you want to run a marathon, the race is the celebration. It's the celebration of all the training you did. And when you start training, you don't start running 10 miles, you start running 1. And that's the key. We don't need a whole bunch of ultra marathon runners. We need millions of people willing to go a mile.
Yeah.
And then when they feel that little boost of fitness, then it's 2 miles, then it's 3 miles, because courage is literally contagious. I mean, that's the pandemic we want next. We want a pandemic of courage. And it starts with doing one thing a day courageous. And then it builds and builds. And the thing that's wild is when you start speaking out, you realize how many people actually agree.
How will they know you if you
That's
don't
what blows my mind.
Define yourself publicly? Instead of focusing on the people that are going to laugh at you, attack you, and there will be, I guarantee there will be, stop focusing on them. Focus on the people that will now see you and come towards you with support, admiration, and respect. They will never know who you are until you stick your head out of the ground and start to show it. That's what you have to focus on. Don't focus on the risk, focus on the reward. And there will be rewards. I speak from personal experience. Everyone that's been in this battle can say the same thing. You will cull the herd of the bad people, the mediocre, the losers, the useless people that surround you in your life very quickly. And then that will create space for the great people to come in and surround you and build up your friend, colleague, and social life. And it will be much richer for it. Much richer. Guaranteed.
Yes. I love it.
Oh,
those are perfect, like, final thoughts.
I want to list
you have anything else, I love it.
Yeah, that's just that may be tough, but should start thinking about, that will make a huge difference in the lives of families and children, to the extent that you're able to do this. And they are, number one, if you have children, take them out of government schools and put them in homeschool. Number two, do not, under any circumstances, allow your child to have access to a smartphone until he or she is of adult age, 18, where you have no legal authority to block it anymore. And then number three, inculcate through modeling and teaching traditional, perhaps you could call it biblical, certainly natural, and I mean truly natural, innate values of masculine and feminine as mother and father and husband and wife with your friends, your family, your children. If you can do 1, 2, or 3 of those things, you will have gone so far in the direction of doing good. You will have done more than 99% of the rest of the country in just one of those three actions. And they are all within the power of any American to do. Anyone can do that. You don't have to have money, you don't have to have strength, don't have to have power, don't have to have a speaking platform or a podcast. You can do those three things.
Perfect. And how do our listeners follow you? Because I know they're going to want to.
Oh boy!
So why don't you let them know where to find your?
If you can't remember
books,
anything at all,
website and your
except Dissident MD, you will be able to find me. Dissident MD. It's my website. It's my Instagram. My podcast is called Informed Dissent with Dr. Jeff Barkey. My Facebook and Instagram are Twitter are slightly different, but you can find all of that by just Googling Dissident MD. You can go to my website. You can go to Amazon through the website. You can go to my Instagram account that way. That's the best way to find me. I've written several books. I have a podcast. I have different social media accounts, but they're all organized under the phrase Dissident MD. That's the best way to reach me. And if you want to read, because I know I'm talking a lot right now, but if you prefer reading, please go to my Substack, which is Dissident MD as well on Substack. And you can subscribe to my weekly 600 word or so 5-minute read for people that, you get podcasted out or audioed out at some point. You can always read. It comes by every week, and it's on I think the most important topic in my view of that week. And I've got probably 2 years worth of Substacks now put out.
Amazing. Thank you again so much, Dr. McDonald, for sharing your thoughts, insights. I was super excited to have you on. And then thanks to our listeners for tuning into the BS Free MD podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time for great talks like this. Over and out.
Well, that was an amazing episode with Dr. McDonald.
So great to have him on. And
so
I was
refreshing.
Excited. And I'm looking forward to getting my books that I won in the mail from him. I will be reading those and then sharing those with everybody on the newsletter, Truth Serum. So please sign up for the newsletter by going onto our website, scroll to the way bottom, and there's a little blip that says Truth Serum, or you can find the link on our Instagram page with the link in the bio there. It's very easy to sign up. But we're going to do a shout out of the week. And this shout out is for Suzanne Steinable.
Thank you for letting us know how much you enjoy our newsletter. We work pretty hard on bringing that. I have actually brought myself to tears with some of that writing. I don't really think I'm much of a writer, but every once in a while, I'm like, I start writing this and I'm like, wow, this is really pulling something out of me. So it means a ton to us when it means something to you.
So thank you so much, Suzanne. We will see you around, and we'll see everybody on our podcast weekly on Thursdays, as well as our Doc Tales with Cocktails and Truth Bomb. Now, a final word from our sponsor. At Pearson Ravitz, they understand that life can change in an instant. It's hard to imagine that a sudden illness, injury, or catastrophic event could put you and your family in a devastating financial situation. Physician-founded and physician-focused, Pearson Ravitz builds human connections before they create quotes. Visit www.pearsonravitz.com today and embark on a journey of safeguarding your future.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
But we try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.